Are you ready to hear a story that seems utterly impossible from the standpoint of military logic and common sense? Imagine this. Just 38 people, including women and children, successfully held out for an entire year against a colossal war machine consisting of 5,000 professional, heavily armed soldiers. This is not a legend or a Hollywood fabrication, but real events from 1885 that stumped the entire American Cavalry Command. An unprecedented campaign was launched against a handful of exhausted fugitives. Telegraphs, the latest equipment, the best trackers, and the unlimited resources of a great power. It would seem the outcome was a foregone conclusion, and it was only a matter of days. But the massive army proved utterly helpless in the scorching deserts and treacherous canyons of the Southwest. While the generals were poring over maps in their headquarters, these 38 men turned nature itself into their deadliest weapon, forcing thousands of pursuers to fight not against the enemy, but against thirst, heat, and their own helplessness. In this episode, we'll take a detailed look at how a handful of people managed to achieve the impossible and humiliate a regular army on its own territory. Watch the video all the way to the end, and you'll learn what the true terrifying price of survival was amid the endless sands and jagged rocks. We'll reveal the secret tactics that allowed this group to literally vanish into thin air right under the patrol's noses. And we'll tell you about the final decision that forever changed the history of these lands. Believe me, you're unlikely to find such details in official reports. Let's get started. What if everything we're taught to believe in pursuit tactics simply doesn't work in the desert? American trackers are used to looking for broken branches, trampled grass, or deep footprints in soft soil. The soldiers completely turned this logic on its head by choosing the hardest surfaces for their movements. They deliberately plotted their routes across rocky plateaus and vast, stony scree fields. The hard rock left not the slightest trace of even an entire detachment of people passing through. The Army's trackers encountered situations where a clear trail would suddenly end at the foot of a rocky slope. The group of fugitives simply hopped from one boulder to another, never once touching the soft ground. This method of movement required incredible physical conditioning and a perfect sense of balance. A misstep on the rocks meant not only leaving a trace, but also sustaining a serious injury. Therefore, every step was calculated with remarkable precision, turning the march into a complex acrobatic feat. The soles of traditional footwear were made of thick leather that did not slip on the sun-heated rocks. The soft material allowed the foot to fully conform to the unevenness of the terrain, ensuring a secure grip on the surface. Warriors could silently traverse steep sections where soldiers in heavy army boots would inevitably fall. The stiff soles of army boots left deep scratches on the rocks, giving away the patrol's direction of movement. The indigenous people's footwear left no scratches, preserving the pristine appearance of the rocky desert. Every ravine and every rocky outcrop was used to change direction. Upon reaching the end of the rocky ridge, the warriors did not descend immediately onto the sand. They could walk several kilometers along the ridge before finding a new rocky section to descend. Thus, the point where they reached soft ground was far from where the trackers had lost the trail. Army patrols spent long hours combing the perimeter around the spot where the tracks disappeared. The technique for moving across the rocks had been honed through years of training in their native mountains. A man had to feel the rock, know which boulder would bear his weight and which would roll downhill. The slightest sound of a falling rock could give away the unit's location in the canyon's echo-filled acoustics. Therefore, movement took place in absolute silence, broken only by the whistling of the wind. The cavalrymen, however, made an incredible racket, their armor and horseshoes clattering against the hard rock. The sweltering heat made the rocks feel like red-hot coals in the middle of the day. Army boots protected against burns but wore out quickly on the desert's hard surface. Traditional leather footwear heated up more, requiring constant monitoring of foot temperature. To avoid overheating, routes across the rocks were often planned for early morning or evening hours. During the hottest hours, the group rested in the shade of rock overhangs, blending completely into the surrounding landscape. The art of stealthy movement on rocks remains an unparalleled example of adaptation to the environment. Military engineers spent enormous resources developing new methods of detecting the enemy. But the simple application of the laws of physics and the properties of materials rendered the high-tech army of that time powerless. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you agree that knowledge of nature trumps technology? Let us know in the comments. Be sure to subscribe to the channel to continue exploring incredible historical facts with us. The hidden truth that everyone keeps quiet about lies in the mathematics of this pursuit. When a large group of people moves together, it inevitably leaves a noticeable trail, disturbs the silence, and consumes a lot of resources. The detachment solved this problem in a radical way, breaking up their already small forces into tiny units. The standard format became moving in groups of just 3 or 4 people. 3 people leave 10 times fewer traces than 30 and move much faster. Such a small group could easily hide behind a single large boulder or in a shallow crevice. They required far less water, which allowed them to use dried-up springs where only a few drops of moisture had accumulated. Food for 3 people could be obtained without making unnecessary noise or making long stops. An army patrol, designed to confront a large detachment, often simply failed to notice such small targets. For the cavalry, this was tantamount to trying to catch a few grains of sand in a vast desert. Moving in small groups demanded the highest level of self-reliance from each person. There was no strict hierarchy of commanders and subordinates in the trio. Decisions were made collectively based on experience. Every member of the group had to be highly skilled in navigation and camouflage. A single mistake by one person in a small group could cost all 3 their lives, so concentration was paramount. Regular army soldiers, accustomed to following officers' orders, could not operate with the same degree of autonomy when cut off from command. The small units moved along parallel routes, remaining out of direct sight of one another. They maintained communication using a complex system of visual signals, invisible to outsiders. An unusually broken branch or a pyramid of 3 stones conveyed the necessary information to the next group. In this way, the scattered detachment maintained a unified information network across a vast territory. This network of signals was completely indecipherable to the military, who were looking for familiar army signals. If the army began an active pursuit of one of the trios, that trio would take on the role of a decoy. The trio would lead the patrol as far away as possible from the main detachment's planned route. They could deliberately leave clear tracks, forcing the cavalrymen to exhaust themselves in an endless chase. Meanwhile, the other groups moved calmly and unhindered toward their intended target. Later, the decoy group would vanish onto a rocky plateau, leaving the soldiers empty-handed in the middle of the desert. Splitting the detachment helped avoid total annihilation in the event of accidental discovery. It is much easier to detect and surround 30 people than 10 groups of 3, scattered over hundreds of kilometers. Even if one unit fell into an ambush, the others continued on their way and maintained their resistance. This ensured the group's phenomenal survivability in the face of overwhelming enemy numerical superiority. Such decentralization rendered the use of classic military strategies of encirclement and annihilation pointless. Rallying points were often located on high ground, offering a clear view for many kilometers around. The first group to arrive took on the role of lookouts, monitoring the safety of the approaches to the camp. They could spot a cloud of dust from an army patrol long before it drew near. When danger appeared, the assembly point was immediately moved to another alternate location. This flexible planning allowed them to avoid the traps the army tried to set along their anticipated routes. Splitting up the unit turned the heavy cavalry vehicle into a clumsy blind giant. The military spent enormous resources and months of time searching for people who simply did not want to be found. The small group technique proved to be a breakthrough in understanding maneuver warfare in difficult terrain. This strategy wore down the soldiers not only physically, but also mentally, robbing them of any hope for a quick victory. In the next chapter, you'll learn how these small groups covered enormous distances in complete darkness without a single light source. A secret that has only recently been revealed lies hidden beneath the veil of absolute nighttime darkness. In the desert, daytime temperatures soared to extreme levels, parching all living things and sapping the last of their strength. The American cavalry preferred to move during daylight hours, when they could navigate by map and see tracks. The fugitives turned night from a time of rest into their main advantage, making forced marches in the dark. The darkness concealed their movements from prying eyes and protected them from the scorching desert sun. While moving, the people maintained a strict distance so as not to bump into one another in the dark. They walked silently, checking the ground before placing their weight on it. Dry branches were carefully pushed aside rather than broken, so as not to create a loud crack in the night silence. A stone rolling from under a foot could cause the entire group to stop until the situation was clarified. The silence of the night desert remained unbroken throughout the entire multi-kilometer march. Navigation in the dark relied on the stars and the distinctive silhouettes of mountain peaks on the horizon. This ability to find one's way without instruments was passed down from generation to generation as a vital survival skill. Army officers with compasses and maps often got lost at night, straying from their intended route. Groups of fugitives always reached their destination precisely, covering enormous distances overnight. By morning, they found themselves dozens of kilometers from where their pursuers expected to find them. At dawn, the night travelers carefully camouflaged their shelter for the coming day. They chose spots in the shade of overhanging rocks or in thick thickets of dry shrubs. During daylight hours, all movement ceased completely so as not to give themselves away with a random movement or raised dust. The detachment rested, regaining strength after an exhausting night march across rough terrain. The daytime hours turned into a period of absolute stillness and observation of the surrounding area. The ability to undertake long night marches wore down the enemy with its unpredictability. The army was always one step behind, arriving at a campsite long after it had been abandoned. The command could not fathom the logic of the unit's movements, operating in opposition to the rest of the world. Darkness became their most reliable ally, concealing their tracks, sounds, and very presence. It was the ideal strategy for avoiding direct clashes with superior forces of heavy cavalry. The art of the night march required iron discipline and the complete suppression of the natural fear of darkness. This tactic proved that nature could be not only an enemy, but also a reliable shield. The military technology of the time was powerless against experience, combined with endurance and knowledge of the terrain. Please like this video if you are also impressed by the endurance and ingenuity of these people. The secret that people pay thousands for lies in a simple piece of thick fabric. Trackers are always on the lookout for distinctive imprints left by footwear or vehicles on soft ground. The horseshoes of army horses or the heavy boots of soldiers would sink into the ground, forming a clear line of travel. To conceal their movements on dusty terrain, a simple yet incredibly effective camouflage method was used. The hooves of pack animals and their own footwear were tightly wrapped in pieces of soft fabric or thick leather. This technique completely altered the nature of the imprint left on any loose surface. Instead of a distinct outline with deep edges, only a barely noticeable, shapeless indentation remained on the ground. From a distance, such a track looked like a common unevenness in the ground, or the mark left by a rolling tumbleweed. An experienced tracker might notice the compacted dust, but it was impossible to determine the age of the track or the number of people from it. The fabric softened the impact on the ground without disturbing the structure of the topsoil as much as a hard sole does. Sometimes bundles of stiff shrubbery were tied to the fabric, dragging along the ground behind the walker. The shrubbery acted as a natural broom, erasing even the faint indentations left by the soft wrapping. After the group had passed, the desert surface looked as if a strong gust of wind had swept across it. Army patrols passed by such areas without paying attention to the slightly ruffled sand. Nature itself completed the camouflage, completely erasing the slightest signs of human presence. This tactic was particularly effective when crossing wide sandy valleys where rocks could not be used. The unit crossed the valley in tight formation, stepping in each other's footsteps to minimize the area of disturbed ground. The last man in line carefully smoothed out any remaining unevenness using cloth or stiff branches. As a result, not a single discernible footprint remained on the stretch of sand that spanned many kilometers. Pursuers reaching the edge of the valley found themselves facing a completely blank canvas of desert. The wrapping technique demonstrated a deep understanding of the psychology of those conducting the pursuit. The military personnel were looking for familiar patterns, clear lines, and predictable footprint shapes. Faced with chaotic indentations, the tracker's brain often classified them as natural anomalies. This cognitive trick worked flawlessly, saving the fugitives precious time to break away. Intellectual superiority in the details made up for the lack of numbers and weaponry. Cavalry soldiers never used such camouflage methods because of their labor-intensive nature. Army standards required marching in column, where every soldier left a clear trail. The military machine moved with noise and clatter, announcing its presence for miles around. The contrast between the army's clumsiness and the silence of the handful of people was striking. A small detail, a piece of cloth on the sole, undermined the entire logic of the army's search. The army was forced to admit that its search methods did not work against such unconventional solutions. The pursuit turned into an endless game where the rules constantly shifted in favor of those on the run. In the next chapter, you will learn how they dealt with patrols in open terrain. An encounter with a military patrol in open terrain always posed a tremendous danger to a small detachment. In the desert, visibility on a clear day reaches tens of kilometers, and hiding on a flat plateau is practically impossible. When avoiding an encounter was impossible, knowledge of the laws of optics and the sun's position came into play. The men planned their route so that the bright desert sun was always directly behind them. The oncoming patrol was blinded by the bright rays shining directly into their eyes. The human eye is unable to clearly distinguish details against the backdrop of the blinding sun. The silhouettes of people turned into blurry dark spots, devoid of depth and clear contours. The soldiers could not determine the exact distance to the object, its size or direction of movement. This optical illusion gave the fugitives a few critically important minutes to make a decision. While the army scouts squinted and tried to make out the target, the group could quickly change position. Glare from bright light also helped conceal the shine of weapons or pieces of equipment. Army patrols often gave themselves away from miles away by the glint of brass buttons or metal parts of their gear. The group of fugitives used matte materials and concealed any reflective surfaces. When the sun was behind them, the rays did not fall on the front parts of their bodies or objects, eliminating accidental glare. The absence of flashes of light made their movement even more covert against the backdrop of the monotonous landscape. Using the sun as a shield required precise calculation of time and speed. The angle of the sun's rays was constantly changing, so the protective effect lasted only for a limited time. The group had to cross the open space before the sun reached its zenith. At noon, when the shadows disappeared and the sun shone directly overhead, the unit preferred to take cover in crevices. Movement resumed only when the light began to work in their favor again. Military officers trained on European tactical manuals rarely took the lighting factor into account so carefully. They were accustomed to relying on binoculars and telescopes, which became completely useless against direct light. Optics only intensified the blinding effect, forcing observers to look away from the bright glare. The high-tech devices of the time were no match for a simple understanding of the local terrain. Sunlight turned expensive army binoculars into useless pieces of glass and metal. This tactic also had a strong psychological effect on the exhausted pursuers. Soldiers began to see a threat in every shadow and every mirage on the horizon. The constant strain on their eyes led to rapid fatigue among the patrolmen, reducing their vigilance. The anticipation of an attack from the blinding sun wore on their nerves more than a long march. The Army's nervous exhaustion became yet another invisible ally of the small group. The ability to use light for camouflage required a deep understanding of the rhythms of the environment. People lived in harmony with the movement of celestial bodies, using their cycles for their own protection. This was knowledge that could not be gained at a military academy. It was formed over long years of observation. Nature provided universal protection to those who knew how to read its cues. Light became an impenetrable wall, behind which a small but elusive group hid. The tactic of using the solar shield demonstrates the remarkable rationality of every action. In conditions of total resource scarcity, every element of the landscape was used with maximum efficiency. The boundless desert sky served as reliable armor against thousands of cavalry. This confrontation proved the superiority of adaptability over brute force and numerical superiority. Every step under the scorching sun was a precisely calculated move in a complex game for survival. What would happen if no one ever learned of this incredible method of blending into the environment? When the group was stationary, its primary objective was to vanish completely from view within the landscape. The military uniforms of that era stood out in color, making the soldiers easy targets against the backdrop of the gray desert. The fugitives, on the other hand, wore clothing made of materials whose colors perfectly matched the shades of the soil. Sand, dusty gray, and faded brown made a person invisible from a distance of 100 meters. To enhance the camouflage effect, their skin and clothing were deliberately rubbed with dust from the area where the unit was stationed. As they moved from the red canyons to the white salt flats, the men adjusted the shade of their camouflage by rubbing in fresh dust. The body ceased to reflect light and blended completely with the texture of the surrounding rocks or sand. When motionless, a person looked like an ordinary boulder or a dry stump, weathered by time. This technique of erasing one's own contours required a deep understanding of the enemy's visual perception. While resting or lying in ambush, people assumed postures that disrupted the familiar human silhouette. The human brain is wired to recognize vertical figures with clearly defined contours. Curled up in a ball among the rocks or stretched out along a log, the warrior deprived the observer of familiar reference points. The geometry of the body adapted to the contours of the terrain, becoming an organic extension of the landscape. Soldiers could pass just a few steps away from a person lying in wait, glancing at them indifferently. Blending into the landscape required absolute stone-like immobility for hours on end. The slightest movement, a wave of the hand, or a turn of the head could instantly give away the position of the entire group. People learned to control their breathing so as not to make unnecessary sounds and to move their chests smoothly. This meditative stillness was the result of strict discipline and constant training. Endurance allowed them to lie on the scorching ground or in the wind without giving away their presence. Army camps consisted of geometrically regular rows of tents, visible from afar. The cavalry brought its own order, standing out starkly against the backdrop of the desert's wild nature. Fleeing groups did not build permanent shelters. Their camps were made of branches and quickly dismantled. After a group left, nothing remained but overturned rocks and flattened sand. Nature quickly absorbed the traces of their brief stay, erasing any information about the direction of their retreat. The ability to blend into the terrain rendered classic cavalry reconnaissance largely ineffective. Patrols returned with reports of empty canyons, even though the enemy might have been right under their noses. Officers grew angry, accusing the scouts of incompetence, unaware of the true reasons for their failures. Invisibility created the illusion of emptiness, in which a massive army fought against elusive phantoms. The soldiers' emotional exhaustion from the constant fruitless searches grew with each passing week. This camouflage saved lives at moments when there was nowhere to retreat due to the terrain. Pressed against a sheer cliff, the group could simply lie down among the rocks and become part of the landscape. Soldiers combing the area passed right through their ranks, unaware of the people's proximity. Patience and confidence in their camouflage skills overcame the instinct to flee immediately. Staying put and becoming invisible often proved safer than trying to break away from pursuit. The art of blending into the landscape became the pinnacle of human interaction with the harsh natural world. They did not resist the desert's conditions, but used its properties to protect their group. It was the highest form of adaptation, allowing them to survive in the face of the army's technological superiority. Merging with the rocks and dust became their reliable armor, stronger than any metal. In the next chapter, you will learn how they applied the art of creating false routes. In addition to the ability to cover their tracks, the art of deliberately misleading the enemy was of immense importance. The unit never moved in a straight line from one safe hideout to another. Their routes were a complex labyrinth of loops, U-turns, and unexpected 90-degree turns. This convoluted movement pattern was designed specifically to exhaust the pursuing cavalry. Army trackers spent hours untangling one knot, while the fugitives created new ones. Often, the group would deliberately leave a clear, deep trail leading in a completely false direction. This trail would lead the patrol deep into the waterless desert or into a dead-end canyon with sheer walls. The men themselves, after traveling several kilometers along the false trail, would turn back, retracing their steps. Upon returning to the fork in the trail, they would head off over the rocks in a completely different direction, leaving no footprints. The cavalry, upon reaching the end of the false trail, would find nothing and be forced to turn back, wasting days. False routes were often laid out toward known army posts or stationary garrisons. This forced the command to pull reserves to defend facilities that no one intended to attack. Huge masses of soldiers were moved in vain, reacting to phantom and non-existent threats. Distracting Army units allowed the group to cross the vacated territories unhindered. The intelligent management of Army maneuvers through the trails they left behind was a sign of the highest tactical mastery. Sometimes the group would split up to create the illusion of a large detachment moving in a false direction. 3 men could leave tracks so dense it looked as if 100 warriors had passed through, moving in a shuttle formation. Scouts confidently reported to officers that the enemy's main forces had been detected in a specific area. Entire cavalry regiments and units were dispatched to pursue this small decoy group. Meanwhile, the real detachment quietly retreated to a safe area over solid rock. Exhausting the horses was one of the main objectives of the tactic of creating false routes. Cavalry transport requires a constant supply of fodder, large amounts of water, and regular rest. Endless wandering through the desert quickly threw the Army's logistics out of order. The dismounted cavalry lost its sole advantage in speed and became utterly useless. Destroying the enemy's mobility without firing a single shot was a masterpiece of evasion tactics. The success of the deception depended on the perfect synchronization of all members of the small group. Whoever left the false trail had to know exactly when and how to safely break away from it. Retracing one's own tracks in reverse required incredible coordination of movements. A single misstep could expose the entire plan and lead the cavalry back on the right path. The highest level of physical fitness made such complex maneuvers routine practice. U.S. Army officers often complained in their reports about these unconventional pursuit methods. They had been trained in linear tactics, where the density of the formation and the directness of their actions were everything. This intellectual game of cat and mouse irritated the command and severely demoralized the rank and file. The Army was fighting an enemy who refused to play by the predictable rules of pursuit. False trails became a symbol of this intellectual superiority of the minority over the unwieldy majority. The disinformation system turned the vast expanses of the Southwest into a gigantic tactical puzzle. The fugitives were the architects of this labyrinth, and the cavalry, captives wandering blindly. Every kilometer traveled along a false trail brought the detachment closer to safety and the Army closer to exhaustion. Cunning and wit confidently triumphed over the discipline and overwhelming firepower of the regular troops. Creating illusions proved to be a more effective tool than sabers and rapid-fire rifles. Another unique natural tool for concealment was the dried-up riverbeds crisscrossing the desert. These winding trenches, carved out by spring floods, served as ideal hidden paths. The high banks of the riverbeds reliably concealed people walking along the bottom from observers on the plain. A detachment could move at full height during the day while remaining invisible to Army patrols. The riverbeds stretched for many tens of kilometers, forming a natural and safe transportation network. The riverbeds often consisted of tightly compacted clay or water-washed gravel. On such a hard surface, footwear left no deep footprints, making camouflage easier. In some places, there were rocky outcrops over which one could move completely silently. The riverbeds served not only as cover but also as a ready-made trail with an optimal surface for walking. Utilizing the natural terrain allowed the unit to conserve energy by avoiding the need to blaze their own trails. Dried-up rivers often led to hidden water sources at the foot of massive mountain ranges. By moving along the riverbed, the unit solved 2 problems at once: covert movement and the search for drinking water. The Army usually moved along high ground or well-trodden paths, avoiding winding lowlands. Soldiers considered riverbeds potential traps due to the risk of sudden landslides. Local residents were highly skilled at reading the landscape and knew when it was safe to be in the lowlands. In places where the riverbed crossed open areas, the banks were often overgrown with dense shrubbery. This natural canopy provided thick shade where the group could rest during the day. The thickets concealed any accidental movements and made visual detection from above impossible. The vegetation also provided fuel for small fires should the need arise. Thus, the dry riverbed turned into a fully functional, hidden camp with natural camouflage. If an Army patrol did descend into the riverbed, spotting the fugitives was extremely difficult. The winding nature of the dry river created numerous blind spots at every sharp bend. The group could hear the cavalry approaching long before making visual contact due to the good acoustics of the lowland. When danger arose, the men simply retreated through side gullies deeper into the rocky hills. The cavalrymen, confined to the narrow space of the riverbed, were deprived of maneuverability and lost sight of their target. The riverbeds were often used to set traps that slowed the pursuers' advance along the route. The detachment would leave a clear trail leading into the narrow canyon of a dried-up river, while the group itself climbed up. Soldiers rushed into the gorge, hoping to drive the enemy into a dead end at the bottom of the dry riverbed. From above, dry branches and dust rained down on the cavalry, blocking the narrow escape routes. This man-made obstacle delayed the advance of the army's mounted column for a long time. Knowledge of all the bends and branches of the dried-up rivers was passed down as a vital part of understanding the world. This detailed map was not drawn on paper. It was stored in the memory of every member of the group. American topographers were only just beginning to plot these complex landscape features on their maps. Lack of knowledge about the terrain forced officers to act blindly, relying on luck and chance. Superior navigation was the key to maintaining absolute invisibility across vast territories. Moving along the riverbeds required caution when emerging onto the surface at the end of a trench. The exit was always carefully planned for areas with hard ground or rocky scree. This prevented leaving tracks on the soft soil of the banks, which could have given away the route. The transition from one hiding place to another was carried out quickly, and only after the terrain had been checked. The stealth of the transition ensured the continuity of the covert march for many hundreds of kilometers. Their use of dried-up riverbeds proves that the landscape was not an obstacle, but a reliable ally to the fugitives. They read the desert like an open book, finding solutions to any tactical challenge within it. The army tried to conquer nature, while a small group of people simply became part of it. This harmony with the environment made them elusive to the massive military machine. The dried-up arteries of the desert reliably hid the people from constant pursuit and detection. The success of the small group strategy depended on the ability to maintain communication over vast distances. In conditions where loud sounds gave away their position, silent methods of communication were used. One of the most complex was a system of visual signals using elements of the landscape. The specific arrangement of stones on a prominent ledge conveyed precise information about the direction of retreat. This communication was completely invisible to soldiers who could not read such specific signs. A broken shrub branch could serve as a signal, indicating the desired direction of further movement. The angle of the break and the height of the branch provided information about travel time and plans. Even a piece of coarse fabric accidentally caught on a thorn could be a carefully planned message. Army scouts ignored these small details, mistaking them for ordinary natural debris. To a trained eye, these symbols formed a detailed map of the entire unit's movements. During the day, a system of signals using sun glare was used over long distances. A smooth piece of stone or metal allowed for the transmission of short flashes of directed light. The signalman was positioned high in the mountains, sending a message to a neighboring group many kilometers away. The flashes were highly directional and lasted only a fraction of a second, making it impossible for the army to intercept them. This optical telegraph worked much faster than the American cavalry's mounted messengers. At night, sounds imitating the cries of birds or animals were used for short-range communication. The quiet hooting of an owl aroused no suspicion among army sentries, who were accustomed to the sounds of nature. However, the rhythm and pitch of these calls contained precisely coded information for their own people. In this way, it was possible to coordinate the actions of several groups while crossing dangerous areas in the dark. The canyons were filled with the false voices of animals, guiding people to safe places. Smoke signals were used extremely rarely, and only when necessary due to the risk of detection. If there was a need to warn the entire unit of a raid, a short column of smoke was raised. Specific dry plants were used as fuel, producing a smoke cloud of a certain color. The signal was sent from a hard-to-reach peak, and the signaler immediately left the position after sending it. By the time the cavalry arrived at the campfire site, only cold ashes remained. Coordination was based on deep trust and strict adherence to pre-approved route plans. If a group did not find the signal at the agreed-upon location, it acted according to a backup plan. Panic and chaotic movements were ruled out. Every person knew their task in any situation. Strict internal discipline replaced military subordination and fear of severe punishment. Responsibility for the success of the crossing was the strongest motivator for precise execution of instructions. The assembly points serve not only as meeting places, but also as important information hubs in an invisible network. The arriving group left hidden signs for those who were to arrive later. This formed a chain of communication that made it possible to track the fate of each three-man unit that had split off. This decentralized command system was ahead of the Army's coordination methods of the time. It ensured flexibility in responding to changes in the situation without the need for lengthy consultations. Regular Army soldiers were heavily tied to cumbersome telegraph or postal lines. Officers waited for hours for orders from headquarters, wasting precious time coordinating actions. The mobility of an Army column was determined by the speed of supply trains and heavy supply lines. While the Army was hampered by its own infrastructure, small groups operated with lightning speed. Freedom from wires and paper orders provided a decisive tactical advantage in maneuvering. The perfect coordination of scattered units ensured the integrity of the entire retreating force. 38 men operated as a single organism, spread out over hundreds of arid kilometers. This invisible information network bound people together more tightly than any strict Army regulations. Wordless communication became the pinnacle of the art of survival under conditions of total and prolonged pursuit. The skill of reading nature's signs made the group utterly elusive to outsiders on this land. The endless pursuit of an invisible enemy had a devastating effect on the soldiers' morale. The cavalry had been trained to attack the enemy in open combat, seeing clear and distinct targets before them. Months of wandering through the scorching desert without a single visual contact undermined the troops' morale. The unknown was more frightening than open combat, causing the soldiers to jump at every rustle. The feeling of their own helplessness in the face of a handful of people gave rise to rumors about the enemy's incredible abilities. Officers lost authority in the eyes of their subordinates due to constant and obvious operational failures. Orders to comb through yet another empty canyon sparked a deep-seated discontent and apathy among the cavalry ranks. The soldiers did not understand why a massive army could not catch up to a few dozen men. Exhaustion from the heat, a lack of proper rest, and constant marches exacerbated the overall crisis. The military machine was breaking down not from direct combat, but from the inability to apply its strength. The fleeing group fully understood this psychological effect and skillfully exploited it to their advantage. They deliberately left signs of their presence near the camps, demonstrating their invulnerability. An ordinary stone, placed in a specific way near a tent, caused great anxiety among the garrison. This message suggested that the invisible masters of camouflage could close in at any moment. The tension paralyzed the command's initiative, forcing them to strengthen their defenses instead of launching an active offensive. The psychological pressure was exerted at zero cost to the small detachment. Every disappearance on the rocky terrain, every false trail, heightened the pursuers' anxiety. The soldiers began to see ambushes in every dry ravine and strained their eyes into the night desert. The constant anticipation wore down their nerves far faster than the long marches exhausted their bodies. The fugitives, however, remained completely calm, confident in the reliability of their methods of concealment. The press of the time fueled the hysteria by publishing sensational articles about elusive groups in the desert. This put additional pressure on the generals, who demanded immediate results at any cost. The rush led to tactical errors, driving Army columns into waterless and treacherous traps. The public criticized the Army for its inefficiency, deepening doubts about the command's competence. A handful of fugitives managed to destabilize a massive system simply by refusing to engage it directly. Composure and boundless patience became the group's main advantage in this war of attrition. They could lie in hiding for weeks, watching as the Army moved aimlessly across the plain. Their calm stood in stark contrast to the chaotic actions of a military machine losing control. Victory in the psychological standoff ensured the unit's survival for an entire long year. Reason and cold calculation proved stronger than blind discipline and overwhelming numerical superiority. The phenomenon of this long campaign has been featured in many studies on asymmetric warfare. It convincingly demonstrated that evasion tactics can be an extremely effective form of resistance. The absence of contact inflicts greater damage on morale than regular predictable skirmishes. The Army is deprived of the opportunity to demonstrate its power, turning long searches into a meaningless routine. This lesson cost the military department enormous sums and forced it to revise many regulations. The experience of 38 people demonstrated the boundless potential of human adaptation to extreme conditions. By maintaining a deep connection with nature, they successfully withstood the industrial era of that time. Technology proved powerless against the ancient knowledge of harmony between humans and the complex world around them. Stealth became not merely a tactical maneuver, but a proven philosophy of survival. This legacy continues to inspire admiration and is studied in detail by historians around the world. The year of confrontation ended not with a complete rout, but with complex agreements and compromises. The cavalry never managed to defeat these masters of invisibility in a fair fight across the vast expanses of the Southwest. Their art of camouflage and movement remained an unsurpassed standard of stealth for future generations. The history of this period proved that incredible endurance and knowledge can stop even the largest army. Knowledge of the elusive people of the desert will forever remain a vivid example of incredible human resilience. We've examined the incredible tactics that allowed a handful of brave people to outmaneuver a massive army for an entire year, proving the superiority of the mind over brute force. Their art of survival and blending into the harsh wilderness still amazes military historians and camouflage experts to this day. What other historical periods related to the culture of North American indigenous peoples or their survival tactics would you like to see in our next videos? Be sure to share your suggestions in the comments so we can prepare the most interesting content for you. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new in-depth dives into the amazing pages of history.